Friends Association. The Vedic Friends Association actually provides resources to all of you who are trying to pursue the Vedic culture in your daily lives. And this is part of, we're having a talk series on tools for human empowerment. And today we have a speaker to discuss how aspects of Vedic culture can actually apply to your life. I'm going to turn over to Anjali Ji, who's going to introduce our speaker. You can go ahead, Anjali Ji.
Namaste, everyone. I'd like to take a moment to introduce our speaker tonight. Phillip Goldberg has been studying India's spiritual traditions for more than 50 years as a practitioner, teacher, and writer. He was trained as a meditation teacher in 1970 by Maharishi Mahesh Yogi and was later ordained as an interfaith minister and spiritual counselor. He has lectured widely in the US and India and conducted workshops online and at a variety of venues. A prolific writer, his articles have appeared in numerous publications, and he is the author or co-author of some 25 books, including Road Signs on the Spiritual Path, the award-winning American Veda, From Emerson and the Beatles to Yoga and Meditation, How Indian Spirituality Changed the West, The Life of Yogananda, the story of the yogi who became the first modern guru, and his latest release, Spiritual Practice for Crazy Times, Powerful Tools to Cultivate Calm, Clarity, and Courage. He blogs on Elephant Journal and Spirituality and Health, co-hosts the popular Spirit Matters podcast, and leads American Veda tours to India. His website is www.phillipgoldberg.com. A very warm welcome to you, Phillip G. Thank you so much for joining us this evening.
Thank you, Anjali. Thank you, everybody else, for inviting me and for joining me. It's an honor to be here. It's always a privilege for me to speak on this topic, especially to people who love India and for whom the Vedic heritage is of personal significance in their lives. And especially today, because of the conditions and circumstances in India make it especially poignant for me, because whenever I give a talk about this history of how India and the soul of India has permeated the life of Americans, I feel grateful once again for India, and just had recently scheduled another tour to lead next February, and this circumstances there make it especially poignant today. So when I researched and wrote American Veda, I already knew when I took on the project that India had the Indian spiritual heritage, and especially Vedanta and yoga, had a big impact on Americans. But I really didn't fully appreciate it until I started doing the research, and I saw just how profound that impact had been. And I thought this is one of the most significant historical developments in American history. And I realized that I would have to convince people because so much of it is not obvious. And so I went out on the limb and said certain things. And that was 10 years ago. And I haven't gotten a lot of blowback. I thought maybe people would argue with me and contradict me, but they haven't. I've gotten angry emails, not angry at me, but emails from people who think what I'm saying is a terrible thing to happen to America. I get that from certain fundamentalists and people like that. But they don't disagree with my analysis. And in the 10 years that have transpired, much has happened that have, in fact, just reinforced the trend lines that I wrote about, and new things have happened, as we'll see. And other developments that started more than 200 years ago have just accelerated. So I want to give you that historical overview. I'm going to share the screen just so you, for the most part, I'm going to show slides of showing the people I mentioned, so you just have a visual sense of who they were. I'm going to focus mostly in the for the distant past. Let me get the screen shared. I'm going to begin with some of the evidence that I gathered to indicate exactly how Vedic heritage has influenced, it's influenced different aspects of American life, but I want to focus mainly on the American spiritual landscape, because it has changed the way large numbers of people, huge numbers of people, understand religion and practice their own spirituality. And a large number of those people are just part of a kind of cultural trend and don't realize they've been influenced by India, because the influence has come, as we'll see, through many different streams and tributaries, and they may pick it up in ways that they don't consciously know have Indian roots or Vedic roots. It's just they start to think differently and practice their spirituality different. So some of the trends, for example, there's been a trend over the last 20, 30 years toward what we can call spiritual independence. People sort of becoming seekers rather than people for whom seeking and discovering spirituality is the primary driver, as opposed to belonging to something they were born into. So when you ask, do you think of spirituality more in a personal and individual sense or in terms of organized religion and church doctrine, 75% say it's more of a personal thing. The other one, and this may be the most important, is when you ask people about their spiritual lives or why they are practiced religion, the most frequent answer is to forge a personal relationship with God. And the definition of God becomes a very different thing as well, as we'll see. Inclusivity and pluralism is also just, you could just see it rising. In 2009, while I was writing American Veda, Newsweek magazine had a column by their religion editor, and the headline was, "We are all Hindus now." She was responding to surveys showing that the Vedic maxim that is usually translated as "truth is one, and the wise call it by many names." That's the Vivekananda translation usually. That a great majority of people agree with that many paths lead to the experience of the divine, and all paths are to be valued. And again, as I said earlier, a shift from what sociologists call dwelling spirituality, in which what you belong to, what you're a member of, defines your relationship to the divine, has been superseded by a seeking spirituality where people feel free to explore and to find what works for them. And when you ask people what they mean by God, another growing number see God as a non-personal or a transcendent force or intelligence, as opposed to the old Western model of an anthropomorphic deity. As someone described it as God is everywhere and in everything, as opposed to someone somewhere. And tatvamasi, when there's a discernible shift in people's understanding of the true nature of the self. And I call it a way from original sin to original ananda, original bliss. These are some of the trends you see. And to me, it's traceable to the growing access to Vedic teachings over the course of some 200 years, and especially in the years when these surveys and studies start to appear after the 1960s, which was a watershed moment in the history we're talking about. So let me, I hope that's kind of understood. You can see in these trends something that starts to sound very Vedic. That's why I say we're becoming a nation of yogis. And some of those people who are yogis in the sense that they are consciously seeking unity with the divine and see the divine as a unitive force that they're part of and not separate from. Sort of the heart of yogic teachings. They've permeated the culture to the point where, this has nothing to do with people in yoga classes or carrying yoga mats. There are people in churches and synagogues and hiking trails and everywhere else that have that attitude about spirituality because of the influence of India. So now let me go into the history here, and I'm going to warn everybody that I have to be very careful not to talk too much about any one aspect of this. Otherwise, I'll go for 2 or 3 hours. So let's begin with, let me put it this way. The teachings, the ideas and practices that came to us from the ancient Rishis down through time, taking on many, many different forms and finding their way to the West from the heart of India. It has come to us in many different forms and through many, many sources. The most important of those sources, and the one most of us are familiar with, are the gurus and the swamis, the yogacharyas, who came from India to spend time in America and teach. The first, of course, as most of you know, was Swami Vivekananda in 1893, when he came to speak at the World's Parliament of Religions in Chicago, a story many of you know. So I'm going to be, I could talk about each of these individuals for at least an hour, but we have to be concise. Vivekananda was, I always call him the Jackie Robinson of American Veda, because He was the first. He was the first Hindu teacher to come here and have an impact. And in so doing, transformed the minds and hearts of a great number of people, overturned certain misconceptions and stereotypes about India, and understand that when he stole the show in 1893, there was a hidden agenda by some of the organizers, not all, but some of the organizers who had influence of the parliament. They were bringing all these representatives from different traditions together, but the hidden agenda was, it will be obvious by the end of the parliament that we, the Protestant ministers who organized it, have the superior, most evolved culmination of religious history. It'll just be obvious. And they were not prepared. Just as, that's why I compare it to Jackie Robinson. They were not prepared for the excellence that Vivekananda represented, and for him to steal the show, to be the star of the whole thing, and to have people write about him glowingly in newspapers and tell their friends, and have to schedule him to give extra talks because the demand was so high for people coming to see him. God knows what would happen if there was an internet back then. And in the time he spent in America, and it wasn't very long, it was only a few years, he went back to India, came here again, went back to India, and died tragically at age 39. But in those years, he established the Vedanta Society in America, left behind buildings and other swamis who came from the Ramakrishna mission in Bellarmut outside of Kolkata. And that tradition continues to this day with well-educated and well-trained swamis coming here to be in charge of the Vedanta societies, which came to exist in every city. Between that and the transcribed lectures of his that became books, many of which are still being purchased and read, and a huge volume of writing, he set the template for all the gurus who were to follow. In the early part of the 20th century, anybody interested in Indian philosophy or exploring the spirituality of India, the main, if not exclusive, way to do that was at the Vedanta societies through the swamis who had started to come. Then in 1920, the man who has been called the first superstar guru of the 20th century came and was the first of the well-known gurus to actually settle in America. And you all know him as Paramahansa Yogananda, the author of the seminal memoir autobiography of a yogi. I wrote a biography of Yogananda, came out 2 years ago, and I came to, I always appreciated him, and he had a big influence on me and millions of other people, largely through that book. And I came to really fully appreciate him as a human being in writing his life story. His impact was extraordinary and continues to be. Autobiography of a Yogi continues to sell thousands of copies, and it's been more than 75 years since it was published. And he left behind too, not only that and other important written works, but an organization that, was well endowed and still highly active and very prominent to this day. And he passed in 1952. But he was an extraordinarily energetic exponent of his tradition and made America his home. And there's a lot to be said for it. His love for India remained with him to the very end, to the last words out of his mouth when he passed. But he only got back to India once in all those years. He was here for 32 years. And he too continued in the tradition. One of the things that's very interesting, and this is a side note for any of you who want to explore this, I get into it in my biography of him and elsewhere, but he was deeply influenced by Vivekananda, and his formative years in India were in Calcutta. You can walk, and I've done this, I've taken tour groups to India. You can walk from the Vivekananda Museum, which is in where he grew up in the family home, to where Yogananda lived in his teenage years and where his family, members of his family, still live. It's a short distance. And so the Calcutta of the late 19th and early 20th century and Bengali culture figures very powerfully in this story. But we have to move on. So between Yogananda, when Yogananda came and the time he became prominent by the mid-20s and 30s and into the 40s, it was him and his lineage and the Vivekananda lineage that were the main sources of Indian spiritual wisdom until the mid and late 1960s. And in the late 60s, everything exploded. There were a variety of reasons for this. This was the years of the counterculture, the post-war years of revolutions in technology and transportation and mass media. So people, and change in immigration laws, there were all kinds of factors, but it was largely the receptivity of the baby boomer generation in America, which was a generation of profound seeking of different ways of understanding the world and how to live a deeper, richer life. And the availability, the accessibility of the Indian sources of Indian wisdom, of Vedic teachings, all of that came together to create, a mass explosion in the 60s. And I'll get into some of the details. But there were so many prominent teachers at that time that I had to create a collage of all of them. And I probably left out people, so please don't complain. And we don't have time to go into everybody who's here. I'm just going to essentially name them and tell you. But what's really interesting when you go back, these are the most prominent teachers from the mid to late 60s through the 70s. And they all had a different angle on the Vedic heritage, bringing out the immense variety of teachings and the diversity inherent in the traditions. And they all attracted different kinds of people, but they all had an impact, and they all left a legacy of institutions and people they trained to carry on their work. Westerners, which is a big part of this story, they all, not all of them, but with rare exceptions, trained others, Americans, to carry on in American culture their work. Krishnamurti, of course, had come here much earlier, but he became much more famous in the 60s and 70s. And he would not like being on this page with these gurus because he did not like gurus. He did not approve of these gurus. And nor did he approve of organized religion or traditions of any kind. He was an iconoclast. but what he was teaching was pure Vedanta. He would not necessarily call it that. And the more he denounced the gurus who were becoming famous, the more famous he became. And the more he said, please don't treat me like a guru, the more people treated him like a guru. But he had an immense impact, and his books, to this day are extraordinary. And of course, you can find videos of him and audios online now and get the full Krishnamurti experience that people had to, go out of their way to do in person back in the day. This is, where's my mouse here? Oops, sorry. This is Maharishi Mahesh Yogi, who became, by the late 60s into the 70s, the most famous of all the gurus, for reasons we'll see in a little later. He became known as the Beatles guru, the giggling guru, and there were cover stories, and he was hugely famous. And if you ever saw, a caricature of a guru back in those days, he was the model for it. But he's the one who put the regular practice of meditation into the culture for mainstream people. And we'll come back to that in a minute. This, of course, is Srila Prabhupada, aka Bhaktivedanta Swami, who, of course, brought ISKCON and the tradition of Gaudiya Vaishnavism, what we call Hare Krishna movement, to the States in the late 60s, and was a very important figure in the promulgation of bhakti. And there'll be more to be said about that. This is Swami Muktananda, who came for the first time in 1970 and had a huge impact on a great number of Westerners in the early 70s in his 3 visits to the US, and brought out various aspects of the phenomenon of Shaktipat and Kundalini experience, and Kashmir Shaivism, which was very little known until he came. And he is one of the only ones who appointed a guru figure to replace him, and chose a woman. He chose her and her brother. That there was a whole scandal around that, but she, woman known as Guru Mai, emerged as the leader, and really in those days was the only female person functioning as a guru. She's still in charge of the Siddha Yoga lineage, and was a very important figure because a lot of young American women were drawn to her because all the other gurus were sort of grandfathers to them, and this was somebody they could identify with. She took, when Muktananda passed in 1982, she became a prominent citizen. Swami Satchidananda, I've separated them, and Swami Vishnu Devananda were both disciples of the legendary Swami Shivananda of Rishikesh, and they came here separately, teaching classic 8-limb yoga, and were among the first to emphasize asana and pranayama practices, and were the first to train what we now think of as yoga teachers. And in between them, for some reason, is the teacher known as Bhagwan Sri Rajneesh, aka Osho, who was the most controversial of the lot, the biggest iconoclast, a figure who attracts great reverence from some people and denunciation from others, but who had a big impact on especially certain number of people who were drawn to his particular sort of quasi-tantric teachings. This is Amrit Desai, who came here as a householder artist and started teaching yoga in the tradition of his teacher, whose name Swami Kripalu. And he became very well known and started the Kripalu Institute in Western Massachusetts. There was a scandal in the 90s. He's still alive and still teaching in Florida. He's the only one here who's still alive. And, oh no, I'm sorry, there's one other. And two others. And in the aftermath of that scandal, Kripalu evolved into a non-guru centered educational institute and is the most successful yoga retreat center in America. And he moved to Florida and teaches at the Amrit Desai, I forget what it's called. This is Baba Hari Das, who came here in the mid-70s at the invitation of certain Westerners, and only passed a couple of years ago. He was known as the silent guru. He gave up speaking while he was still in India and spent all his time here, founding the Mount Madonna Center in Northern California, which still exists, and a large number of people following him, and spoke by writing on a slate, a little blackboard. And this, of course, is BKS Iyengar and his Gurubai Patabi Joyce, who were disciples of Krishnamacharya, and they were largely responsible for the explosion of interest in Hatha Yoga. This is Swami Rama, who started the Himalayan Institute. It was another influential figure. This is the person known back in the 70s as the 13-year-old perfect master who named Maharajji, who as a teenager said, I don't want to be this guru figure anymore. I'm not the world savior you're making me out to be. I want to get married and have kids, and he did. And he's still teaching under his original name, Prem Rawat, all around the world. This is Sri Chinmoy, who had a community, spiritual community in New York, and had also had a big influence, but I just peeked at the clock and I have to move on. All these people had an influence, and to this day, their legacy continues. I want to give a shout out to certain great masters who never came to America, but had a big influence on America through their writings, through people who went to see them and came back and spoke about them, and through people who carried on teaching in their name subsequently. This, of course, is Ramana Maharshi, who died in 1950, but is far better known today than he was while he was alive in the West, because of the influence of certain people. Sri Aurobindo also died in 1950 and became very well known in the late 50s and 60s in the San Francisco area, particularly in the early days when of the advent of humanistic and transpersonal psychology. The institute, known as the California Institute of Integral Studies, started out as an organization teaching in his name. This is Krishnamacharya. We already mentioned his two chief disciples who came to the West, Satchidananda and Vishnudevananda, a great innovator and reformer of the Hatha Yoga tradition. This is Neem Karoli Baba, who was a quiet, reclusive teacher in northern India until the man who became known as Ram Das, who met him when he was Dr. Richard Alpert and left as Ram Das. He made Neem Karoli very famous, and entourages, brought entourages of young Americans to see him. And there are people now who hold Neem Karoli as their guru, who were born after he passed in 1973 or 4. And a great number of influential Americans, most importantly, Ram Das, were disciples. And this is Anandamoy Ma, who not many people knew about or know about, but those who do, you know, she's beloved. Yogananda devoted a chapter to her in his book, and some people of a certain age now were lucky enough to be in her presence when they were young seekers. And many more people who never met her, like me, have made pilgrimages to her ashrams in India. And this is Swami Shivananda. And we mentioned, I'm sorry. I said Krishnamacharya. I mentioned Satchidananda and Vishnu Devananda. No, I meant Iyengar and Patabi Joyce. Shivananda was the guru of Satchidananda and Vishnu Devananda, and his Divine Life mission in Rishikesh is still a place where many Westerners go on pilgrimage and to take retreats. And that tradition of gurus coming here continues to this day. I just, you know, singling out the four probably most prominent or best known of them. That, of course, is Amma, the woman known as Amma, who came here for the first time in the 80s. And now when she comes, many thousands of people go to see her. This, of course, before the pandemic. Every time, you know, she does a tour to America for her famous hugs. This is Sri Sri Ravi Shankar doing product placement for my book, for the hardcover version. And this is Sadhguru, who has become very well known in the US in recent years. And I should actually, right now, I think as we're doing this, he's promoting his new book about karma, and in an interview with Deepak Chopra. And I'm one of the people interviewing him online in a few weeks about his new book. And this is Sri Karuna Mai, who also has a significant following in the US. Now, I want to give you, I'm going to have to do it very quickly, but I'm going to give you a brief overview of the Americans who absorbed the teachings, integrated them into their own lives, adapted the Vedic wisdom into their own work and their own fields of expertise, and promulgated them, sometimes very explicitly, sometimes implicitly, in sort of, you'd have to know their history to know it was coming where it was, where these ideas originated, and then promulgated it, and in some cases to millions and millions of people, some of whom don't know that they're being influenced by India. This is Ralph Waldo Emerson, that's Henry David Thoreau, and they were the principal transcendentalists, enormously influential in the history of America. Every student reads Emerson and Thoreau. The first time I ever heard of the Bhagavad Gita was when I was reading Thoreau's Walden. And I ran out to get a copy. I was a student in New York City, and I couldn't find a copy of the Gita. I had to find an occult bookstore and finally got it. Now, of course, you know, you can get 20 translations with the click of a mouse. Emerson was deeply impacted by Vedic teachings, said so explicitly, and you know, I won't say more. There's so much more to be said, but just know that these are among the most important thinkers in the history of America, and they owe a lot of their insights to India, and anybody reading them and being influenced by them, whether they know it or not, is being impacted. Later in the 19th century, what came to be called the New Thought movement began. This is Madame Blavatsky, who started Theosophy. This is Mary Baker Eddy, who started religious, Christian Science. This is Charles and Myrtle Fillmore, who started the Unity Church. This is Ernest Holmes, who came later and started Science of Mind, which are now called Centers for Spiritual Living. Unity and these centers for spiritual living are still hugely popular, maybe more popular than they ever were. They look on the exterior like Christian churches because they have Sunday services and all that. But if you look at what they're teaching, it's pure Vedanta, given a Christian twist or a Western twist. And the founders were very explicit about what they owed India. So did Madame Blavatsky, of course. Mary Baker Eddy hid the influence much more. And then one group of people to whom we owe a great deal are the sort of public intellectuals, public thinkers. This was Aldous Huxley. This is Houston Smith. This is Joseph Campbell. Each of them was enormously famous especially in the 60s and 70s, and to this day. Their books sold in the millions. Their appearances on the lecture circuit attracted thousands. When they were on television, as Joseph Campbell and Houston Smith were famously on series on PBS, millions of people watched them. They all owed a great debt, especially to the Vivekananda Vedanta lineage. Aldous Huxley came here as already famous as an exile from Britain in the war years or pre-war years. Became a student of Swami Prabhavananda in LA, along with his compatriot, Gerald Hurd and Christopher Isherwood. They started the Vedanta Press. They started a journal of Westerners writing about Vedanta. They wrote best-selling books. Isherwood and Prabhavananda collaborated on the first Gita I read, and many, many others read, and other books. Enormous influence. Houston Smith was the most famous scholar of religion. His textbook on the world's religions has a very Vedantic orientation, and anybody lucky enough to have been assigned it in college would have had that orientation. Similarly, he studied with a Swami in St. Louis as a young man at the Vedanta Society. That influenced his whole life. And he says so in the introduction to my book, To American Veda. Joseph Campbell studied with Swami Nikhilananda when he was a young scholar, and that influenced his whole career, and he became a world famous scholar of the world's religions and world's mythologies. This is Alan Watts, who was an Episcopal minister who moved to San Francisco and became big part of the beatnik scene in the 50s, and an enormously popular translator of all the Eastern traditions, including Hinduism and especially Zen Buddhism. His lectures and videos today can be accessed. He was a great character and a brilliant thinker and translator. And this is Ken Wilber, who's still alive, but I wanted somebody from the modern era who was like them, a public intellectual, deeply influenced by both Buddhism and Hinduism and modern psychology, and has his own sort of integral theory that brings the Enlightenment teachings into the modern world of psychology. Physicists were drawn to Vedic teachings. This is Tesla, who became a pal with Vivekananda and wrote about Vivekananda, and Vivekananda wrote about Tesla. This is Robert Oppenheimer, who's called the father of the atomic bomb, who would quote the Gita at various times, and famously when the first bomb test went off. This is Erwin Schrödinger, the Nobel Prize winning quantum physicist, who was a great student of Vedanta and talked about how physics ties in to Vedanta. So did Werner Heisenberg, whose picture I inadvertently left out. And this is Fritjof Capra, a modern physicist who wrote the groundbreaking book, The Tao of Physics, bringing the teachings that come to us from the East into showing the parallels with quantum physics. Psychology embraced these teachings. William James knew Vivekananda and wrote about Vedanta theory and ideas in his book, especially his book, The Varieties of Religious Experience. Carl Jung wrote about yoga and yoga philosophy. Abraham Maslow, who was the father of breakthroughs in psychology beginning in the 60s that came to be known as humanistic psychology and transpersonal psychology. The teachings of India elevated psychology to a level where the study of the spiritual dimension of life became a legitimate thing. This is Stan Grof, who was a buddy of Muktananda's and was a founder of transpersonal psychology. So was Charles Tart. And this is Dr. Richard Alpert, who was the Harvard professor who, along with Timothy Leary, started studying spiritual experience through the use of LSD, became infamous, was fired from Harvard, went to India to learn more about these the traditions, and ended up becoming Ram Dass, one of the most famous Western teacher of these traditions. It influenced the medical community. This is Dean Ornish, who as a medical student was a disciple of Swami Satchidananda. This is Dr. Oz, as you all know, who learned yoga and yogic philosophy from Dean Ornish. And this, of course, is Deepak Chopra, who was an endocrinologist in Boston and met Maharishi Mahesh Yogi, decided to take his advice and study Ayurveda, and now is, of course, Deepak. And I want to quickly say that the teachings influenced important Western religious figures. These are three Catholic monks who were explicit about their embrace of Hinduism and Buddhism and how it influenced their own spirituality and their own interpretation of Christianity. This is Thomas Merton. This is Bede Griffiths. This is Father Thomas Keating, who started what came to be known as centering prayer, which he drew specifically from mantra meditation methodologies. There are Jewish equivalents, rabbis who teach Jewish meditation, who studied in India, and it influenced their Judaism. This is an enormous factor, an enormous thing that needs to be studied, but we don't have time now. And oh God, how am I going to do this in a short amount of time? It influenced novelists, Hermann Hesse, Somerset Maugham, J.D. Salinger, who studied with Swami Nikolananda in New York, poets, Walt Whitman, T.S. Eliot, W.B. Yeats, Allen Ginsberg, and of course, musicians, beginning the time Ravi Shankar came to America, and then he influenced jazz and other avant-garde artists, and then became pals with George Harrison. And this was a watershed moment, because through this, George became essentially as Hindu as any Westerner can be. And that led he and the Beatles to learn transcendental meditation. That took them to India with cover stories like this in the news. It was a big mass media explosion. It put transcendental meditation and meditation in general, yoga in general, onto the map because of them. And I want to just give a shout out to George's post-Beatles career, when he was famously a bhakta and a devotee of Krishna, and his own solo work. This led to the phenomenon of meditation practices and Indian philosophy going mainstream, and scientific research being done on these methods. So by the mid-70s, it had gone from a countercultural phenomenon into the mainstream. And that has its plus side in exposing millions more people to these teachings, but at the same time, them becoming kind of appropriated by medical doctors and psychotherapists, and in many ways adulterated and distorted. That's something we all have to deal with. This is Ram Dass after coming back from India and attracting people. And there were many others. This is me in the mid-70s when I was teaching TM because Maharshi made us clean up, and I got this suit at Goodwill. So because he made us look mainstream. And there were always Hatha yoga teachers starting in the 50s and 60s, like these people. But then it exploded in the 70s because of Iyengar and Patabi Joyce, and the yoga journal started, and yoga became synonymous with asanas, which of course, like as I just said, had the influence of making millions and millions more people, attracted to the yoga traditions, but also diluting it so that many people see it as just a fitness exercise. And then, in recent decades, certain other influences that I only touched upon briefly in American Veda, but have become much more pronounced, like the popularity of kirtan. Prior to the pandemic, there were huge kirtan festivals, and yoga studios would have kirtan events on weekends and attracting thousands of people. And now there are kirtan superstars like Krishna Das and others, whereas back in the day, it was just the ISKCON people, out in the streets doing kirtan, and people thought they were weird. And now, it's part of the yoga scene. And a big thing I want to mention is the advent after the immigration laws changed in 1965. The phenomenon of Hindu American citizens in large numbers, now, first, second, third generation born here, becoming prominent citizens, going to school with Christians and Jews and others, marrying them, becoming best friends with them, being on television, being in the White House. All this has had a tremendous impact and will continue to, in an ongoing, very subtle, informal way, just as Jews became mainstream 100 years ago and Catholics became accepted. Hindu Americans will become accepted, and that is changing the way Americans understand religion and spirituality in the same way that all the other influences I mentioned had been doing for 200 years. I'm going to stop now because I ran late and I apologize, but you have no idea what I left out.
Thank you very much, Phil G. It was a wonderful discussion about all the personalities that came over the years to spread the Hindu Vedic tradition. For the sake of time, I'd like to turn it over to Anjali G. If there's any questions we have from our viewers. You're on mute, Anjali.
Thank you, Rajji. There is one comment to the group from Debojit Bora. This is an incredibly long list, but there are yet some not in the list, such as Madhanath Swami of ISKCON and many more.
Yes.
So
I had to leave people out, of course, and I left out a lot of contemporary people. I left out a large number of Americans, like people in Vedic Friends Association, who were devotees of certain teachers and great students of the Vedic tradition who became teachers in their own right, Radhanath Swami is one of them. I just mentioned Ramdas because he was the most famous, and he was sort of set the template for all the younger ones, like, you know, like me, but also, you know, David Frawley and all the others who are, you know, some very well known and some not very well known, but who write books and publish articles and have students, and who are carrying on the tree. And this is important because there are some of us who value these traditions so highly. We are honored to represent a lineage, to have been trained in a lineage, and to, you know, to hold it dear. Others go out on their own. Some of us do our best to protect the integrity of the teachings as best we can. Others, we all have to adapt to America. Vivekananda adapted to America. Yogananda adapted to America. Maharshi and they all had to change their language and, you know, adapt. But there's ways of adapting that is skillful and don't distort the teachings. And there's ways of doing it that dilute the integrity of the teachings. And this is something all of us who care about this have to take responsibility for being vigilant about. And some of the people do it well. And then there are many people representing these teachings, some of whom are self-appointed and some of whom were credentialed, but who do questionable things in order to gain an audience. And so this is something that's of concern to many of us.
So if I may ask.
Sorry for leaving out my friend Radhanath Swami, but I've left out many.
So if I may ask a question, there clearly are so many spiritual presences in the world that have added value to Vedanta and to understanding of it all. But if you were a beginner on this path and you did not know any better, and you had this entire list of, you know, famous names and books and just sources to read from, where would you suggest someone start? Who breaks it down really simply without, of course, you know, upsetting anyone else? Is there one author, one book, one source that you would
I'm
say?
not going to say read American Veda. I won't do that.
No plug for your book?
It would not be appropriate. Well, no, I know this is a hard question, and I ask it of other people. You know, I have a podcast I recommend. It's, you know, it's free, so I can recommend it. We don't make any money. It's our seva. I co-host it with somebody else. It's called Spirit Matters. It's online. There's about 250 audios that you can access at spiritmatterstalk.com. We now have we now do them on video. So the last 10 or 12 are on YouTube channel. And we often ask people, where would you start? Depending on who we're interviewing. Mm-hmm. Where would you have people start? And I'm going to say what most of them say. I would talk to the person and find out what they're drawn to. Do they have a natural inclination toward bhakti? Are they jnani types? Do they want to study? Do I recommend autobiography of a yogi because they want a good story that has the teachings in them? Do I send them to an ISKCON center because they're bhaktas? Do I send them to learn transcendental meditation because they're method oriented? They want to practice a meditation practice. Do I recommend the books that came out from the Vedanta Society because they want to understand Vedanta? So, you know, are they scholarly? So it depends on the person.
Fair enough.
Well, we would like to conclude tonight. Anjali, that was a great question. And Philji, I think you had a really good answer for that, depending where somebody's coming from as far as where to start. I think that helps all our viewers tonight. Thank you very much for all your knowledge you shared tonight. You're welcome anytime to the Vedic Friends Association presentations. And I think with that, we'll wrap it up.
I'm on the mailing list. I would invite people, because of the short amount of time, my website, phillipgoldberg.com. You can email me through there. I'd be happy to hear from you, answer your questions, or continue the conversation.
If I could
Thank
just
you
close
all.
with one last comment, Balabhadraji has said, Hare Krishna, Philji. Thank you for your wonderful and comprehensive presentation. We are honored to have your participation in the work of BFA. So on behalf of our president, thank you so much for being here with us tonight and sharing your knowledge with us. We appreciate it.
It was my honor. Keep up the good work, and please remember the vulnerable people in India at right now.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank
Good
you.
night, everyone.